Bridget, or Brìde, a pagan goddess and a Christian saint. So, my friends, it still feels like we're in the depths of winter, but the first stirrings of spring are coming. Imbolc, or Imbolc, is almost upon us, 1st of February, or, as it is often said, Saint Bridget's Day. But who is Saint Bridget, and what is her connection to the earlier pagan goddess of Brìde or Brìde, and what is her connection with Imbolc? So Imbolc is one of the 4 Celtic fire festivals or feast days popular in Christianity and contemporary paganism, and was a very important ritual day in the calendar for our pre-Christian Celtic-speaking ancestors. It sort of means in the belly, perhaps, maybe the birth of summer on its way, or something to do with ewe's milk. A few different theories there, but it sits between winter solstice or Christmas and the spring equinox round about Easter. So it's one of the cross-quarter days, along with Beltane, or Bealtaine, and Lunasa, and of course Samhain, or as we know it in English, Halloween. So it's a very important day, both for Christianity and pagan religion, ancient and modern. Associated with this day is, of course, as well, Bridget's cross, or the 4-armed cross, particularly in the island of Ireland, less so in Britain. So I'm going to tell you a little story about Saint Bridget, because she's a really interesting character sitting at the threshold between Christianity and pagan thought. I've made a few videos now on the legends of the saints, trying to sort of scope out any pagan resonances or residues or echoes in our popular saints. And with this particular one, unlike any other, you really don't have to do that much digging. It's quite overt. Saint Bridget was a Christianization of a pagan saint, and they share a lot of similar qualities, both patrons of poets and muse of poetry, both to do with healing, both associated with the springtime, both possibly associated with fire and the sacred fire, and the coming of new life to the world. They also have some differences as well, so I'll get into those as well. But it's just such a wonderful bridge, a syncretic bridge between the pre-Christian religion of Celtic polytheism and Druidism and early Celtic Christianity. So much of the earlier religion feeding into this. And this is a much later medieval retelling of a story that kind of just fuses Celtic paganism and Celtic Christianity together in a wonderful way. So I'm going to tell the story now, and then tell a bit of other folklore about Saint Bridget and also the goddess Brìde as well. Long ago, long ago, when the islands of Britain and Ireland were ruled over by all sorts of little Celtic chieftains, a little patchwork of Celtic kingdoms were these islands. And in the place of power, of course, were the Druids, the magical and religious specialists and leaders of the day. Now, on the island of Ireland, in northern, what we would now call Northern Ireland, there was a certain prince. His name was Dougal Dunn in this story. Sort of a son of a petty chieftain. Now, this chieftain was falsely accused of wrongdoing by the daughter of an arch-druid. This young woman falsely claimed that Dougal Dunn had slept with her and made her conceive a child. She said that she had fathered this child. No matter that Dougal protested his innocence, I have never been near this woman's bed, he said. The girl's father, the arch-druid, held sway with the High King and knew many influential people at court. So her version of events held sway. So Dougal Dougal was he was banished from Ireland. He was put into a little coracle, a little skin boat, with the baby girl swaddled in his arms, and he was pushed out to sea, following the footsteps of so many before him. Over the Irish Sea he went, in the wake of Cuchulainn and Finbuckle before him, and he landed on the west coast of Britain, the Western Isles, on an island we now call Iona in the Hebrides. Dougal landed in that little skin boat on the sacred, even then it was a sacred green island of Iona. And there, as if waiting for him on the shore, his hair long and silver, his robes decorated with seashell and bits of stone, woad upon his face, was a druid, an arch druid. And Dougal introduced himself. I was a prince of Ireland, he said, and I was falsely accused by a woman of bearing her this child, and now I was put ashore in a boat, and shh, said the druid. Let all those thoughts of the past whisper into the sea air and be of nothing. Now you are not Dougal, Prince of Ireland. I shall rename you Dua, the farmer of Iona. Let this child be your daughter and raise her as your own. Let her roam free on the island. Let the sun and the stars and the birds and the wave be her teachers. I foresee a great future for her. She will be great, great among all the Gaels. She will be the greatest child that has yet ever been born. This I foresee. And at that, the little child got out of that coracle skin boat, clasped her fat pink baby hands together and spoke in perfect Gaelic. Though I am but a child, my mantle will be laid upon the King of all the world. It was Bridget's first miracle. And the druid there and then named the little girl Brìde, means the exalted one. And the druid took his leave, and Dougal, Prince Dougal, or Dua as he has now been renamed, built himself a little farm at the edge of the island and a little farmstead, and indeed the Prince of Ireland became a simple, humble farmer of Iona, and he raised that little shining cherub of a girl as his own daughter. And she soon became very, very, very industrious and very, very hard-working, but she had a certain fault, or her foster father saw it as a fault. Anyway, whatever crops they managed to grow, or vegetables they grew, or whatever milk they could gather from their few sheep, she would give half of it away to whoever asked for it, whichever travellers or members of the poor in the very, very small community of the island of Iona. She would always give half of everything away, no matter how much her foster father, scolded her for doing it. She would not stop. But she was such a delight to her foster father's eyes. She was always singing and communing with the animals. She had a certain gift of communication with the world around her, both the waves and the trees and the birds and the animals and the fishes. She could speak the hidden, secret language of the world. Now, one day, on the eve of her 16th birthday, Brìde, she went for a little walk up the hill in the middle of Iona, long been a sacred site for the Druids in the pre-Christian religion. And there, before dawn, she met that Druid there that was courting the dawn, singing praise to the rising sun. And Brìde had come to gather water from the well of eternal youth that is still there, just a little cleft in the rocks, a sacred well both to the Christian and pre-Christian peoples of that island. And there the druid gave Brìde her blessing, his blessing. Now, when Brìde went to get water from that well on this day. She saw a reflection in the water. This was after the druid had given his blessing on her 16th birthday. She saw a reflection in the surface of this pool. It was not her face. It was not pale and fair-haired like Brìde was, fair hair and freckles of the Gael. It was a olive-coloured complexion, beautiful oval face with dark hair and dark eyes, and their eyes met in the water. And Brìde looked up, but there was no woman standing across from her in the pool, and she looked down at the rippled water and the figure was gone. But it was indelibly sealed into her memory. She knew that, for some reason, she knew this woman. She knew this woman deeply from another life. She always carried her image in her heart. Now, one day, sometime later, Brìde was crossing the fertile plain of Iona towards her father's house at the edge of the sea. She could see the little, curl of peat smoke curling up from the thatch of his little home. And as she went through the plain, she lost sight of his house for a while, and she was going through an area of trees, and for some reason she decided to take a different route to the route she normally took home. The reason was this: a little robin had alighted on a branch of a tree, and it was just singing so beautifully and was just hopping from one tree to another, speaking in that secret language of birds that Bridget sort of understood, that she had to follow it. So she followed that little robin from tree to tree to tree, going a different route, until that robin alighted on the arch of two entwined rowan trees making a door together. And that robin was singing there on top of the arch, and Bridget was going towards. You want me to follow you, little robin, I can tell. And the robin tweeted and then flew through the arch and was gone. And Bridget followed beneath the arch and then came out somewhere else. Gone were the green hills of Iona. Gone was the pale blue sea. Gone was her little father's huts with the pale blue curl of peat smoke. Brìde was standing in the middle of a desert, scorching hot desert with a deep, cloudless blue sky above her. She began to sweat and her mouth began to dry out, and she, as if in a dream, made her way forwards to where her foster father's house would have been. And sure enough, it was there in a little settlement of other mud brick houses, and there was her foster father's house, but it was different. The same, but different. The proportions were similar, but different, as if in a dream. Her foster father's house was now an inn. Brìde opened the door of the inn, and there was the face of a man who looked like her foster father, and he spoke to her. Brìde, she said, in a language she could understand, although it was somehow different. He spoke to her with recognition, but his complexion was dark and his eyes were dark. He said, Brìde, you're back. We are in the middle of a drought right here. I need to go on this donkey here to fetch water. I will be 3 days. You have just enough water, a stoop of water here, a little stoop with some wine in it, and just a few flatbread and dried fish for you to eat. This will be enough until I return. You will have to look after the inn for me, my daughter. Admit no strangers. We do not have room for them, and give no food away. We do not have enough to spare. You just have enough for yourself. Wait for me. I will be back with water in 3 days. Admit no one. And with that, this strange man that seemed to be her foster father in another life that Brìde had just dropped into, the man departed. And Brìde was left with her instructions and her small stoop of wine and water. She drank some of the wine and ate some of the bread. Now, at nightfall, it became bitterly cold. And many people came to the inn, and Brìde had to turn them away. And many people came to ask for food, but she had to turn them away, until a couple came very, very, very late. And it was clear that the woman was in the very late stages of pregnancy, and the man was very, very old, with curly brown hair and grey in his beard, and he was bent, and he did not look very well. And they asked if they could have shelter for the night, and Brìde said, there is no room at the inn, but you can stay in the stable. Her foster father had said nothing of the stable. So she put this couple and this pregnant woman to sleep. And then the woman looked at Brìde and said to her, do you not recognize me, Brìde? And Brìde said, I do. I do. It was the woman whose face she had seen in the well all that time before. So Brìde, she put the couple away in the stable, and she even went to get a bucket of fire from in the inn and put it in an empty manger, and made a sort of brazier of hot coals in there to keep the stable warm for them. And she gave this couple her last little ration of water and wine and a little bit of flatbread that was there. And then she went back into the inn to take care of some of the other guests. She went back some time later, and she was blinded because in the sky above the stable was a bright, bright star, the likes of which she had never seen before. And when she went in, a little radiant child had been born. And Brìde, you know what she did? She took off her mantle, off her cloak, and wrapped the child in it and placed it in the hay, and the brazier of embers had almost gone out, but a little robin appeared flying through the window. Perhaps it had followed Brìde through that Rowan gateway all the way from Iona, and the robin began to flap its little wings and kindled the fire and made a blaze again. But it burnt its chest feathers in the fire. And the mother of the child blessed the little robin, and its feathers grew back red. And the robin has always had a red breast from that day. And Brìde went to collect the stoop of wine and water and flatbread, and found that miraculously it had replenished itself. The water jar was full again, the wine jar was full, the flatbreads and fish had replenished, just in time for 3 wise men from the east to enter, and various other kings and magi from across the land to assemble, and could be fed this bread and wine and witness the birth of the risen Lord. For the couple were, of course, Mary and Joseph, and Brìde had stepped from the island of Iona directly into the scene of nativity. So just imagine the scene a day or two later, when the landlord of the inn, Brìde's foster father in Bethlehem, returns on his journey, his donkey ride with sacks of water, and there's this great commotion outside the inn, and his ears are filled with the sound of streams. Streams have begun trickling all across the arid landscape of Judea, and blossoms, spring flowers are blooming all around his inn, the likes of which he has never seen before. And he arrives, and the little stable is filled with a throng of people, the magi from the east in their orange robes and shaved heads, and all the rabbis and all sorts of people who come to pour praise upon this little baby child, the king of all the world. And there she was, wrapped in Bridget's mantle. Mary and Joseph stay at the inn for a while, and then they take their little baby Jesus back home after the census. And Brìde stays a while in the strange home, in this strange community. And then one day, she's walking across the desert by the sea, and she comes across a certain old tree, and she walks beneath that tree and looks up, and she's no longer in the desert. She's surrounded by the green hills of Iona and the blue ocean. And there is her father's little farmstead with a curling blue coil of smoke reaching up. And she went home, and her foster father was there waiting for her. Hello, Brìde. Maybe that old druid too. And that is why Brìde is sometimes called Mary of the Gael, or Bridget, the midwife of Christ. What a strange and unusual tale there. What a piece of religious syncretism that is, hey? Using a story like that to take a pagan goddess and a Christian saint and kind of segue them into the biblical story of the Nativity, one of the central stories of the Christian mythos, using many elements that are also present in Celtic folklore, like this idea of a gateway between worlds. The version I just told is heavily influenced by a version told in Out of the Mouth of the Morning, Tales of the Celt by David Campbell. David Campbell is a Scottish storyteller who I've never met, despite us having many mutual friends, but I picked this up in the Storytelling Centre of Edinburgh. There's many similar versions of that story, though. In that story, there's an arch of Rowan. I don't know if that's David's idea or if that's the local Hebridean version of that tale. It's probably not, because I've heard other versions of that story where instead of an archway of Rowan, which is the sort of gateway, it's maybe a burial chamber, a long barrow that Bridget walks into, and inside is the stable in Bethlehem. Amazing image there of one of the old she mounds and a goddess who used to be one of the two are today, who became the she, segueing into Christian mythos. It's mind-blowing for me. In other versions of the story, it's also maybe two standing stones, stone circles, as well, being a liminal point in British and Irish spirituality. Stone circles, megaliths, gateways in trees, also the surface of the sea. In Celtic folklore and belief and spirituality, these are liminal spaces. It's worth also mentioning in some of the early hagiographies of the life of Saint Bridget. Bridget is the daughter of a Christian slave woman who is the slave of a druid. That's often a kind of narrative in these early Celtic Christian saints. And she is bringing milk to the druid, and she gives birth in the doorway of the druid's house. Another kind of liminal connecting symbology there, as well as the milk, which the earlier goddess Bridget may well have been associated with through Imbolc, and that Saint Bridget is also related to as well. So really interesting, and so much folklore attached to the Saint Bridget figure, which is of a miraculous wonder tale nature, and much of it may have its roots in pre-Christian belief and folklore. Also, it's worth saying that a lot of this folklore might be from the Christian medieval era, even though it has fantastical elements in it, and might be sort of back projected into a pagan past, because there are differences with the pagan goddess Bridget and the Christian Saint Bridget. In one of the later stories, Bridget hangs her cloak on a sunbeam, which is just this wonderful image. And the mantle, the cloak of Bridget in contemporary paganism, has become one of the goddess's symbols, one of her items, even though it doesn't feature much in early Irish mythology of the goddess herself. So that's one of these ideas where later folklore seems to have been kind of back projected into a pagan past. But it's often more complicated than that, and often I think it might go in both directions. For example, there's another story about Saint Bridget of Kildare. Kildare means Church of Oak. This is one of the principal places outside of the Western Isles of Scotland where Bridget is associated with in Ireland. So Kildare is sort of in the middle of Ireland, and there was a historical saint, a historical abbess, who supposedly founded the Church of Oak there, whose name was Bridget. So there's a story associated with the founding of that monastery. A local Irish chieftain agreed to give this funny Christian preacher, this nun, as much space as she could spread her cloak out on the ground to build her church. Not a lot of space, about as much as this table. But when she spread her cloak, it miraculously increased in size and covered acres and acres and acres. And the chieftain willingly gave her all that land for her sort of parish and to build her church on. This often happens, this is a very common theme in European folklore, a kind of demarcating of space and maybe a magical or miraculous changing of size to kind of get more space. This, I would say, goes right back to Indo-European mythology and creating order out of chaos, and probably has its roots in our transition to farmers from hunter-gatherers. Order in here, wild out there, domestic in here where we keep the cattle, wilderness out there, chaos and chaotic gods out there, are gods of order in here. So is that spreading of a cloak a relic of a much more ancient thing? So are contemporary pagans that like to big up Bridget's cloak, are they not wrong in considering it a very ancient thing, even if we can't connect it to the goddess Bridget in the Irish mythological cycle? In Indian mythology, for example, just as a point of comparison, this spreading of a mantle that Bridget does is very similar to, for example, Vishnu, the god Vishnu in the form of the dwarf Vamana, is that his name? He tricks the demon king Bali, who owns all of the cosmos at the moment and has sort of relegated the gods to one side here. Interesting parallels with the Irish mythological cycle, actually. But Vishnu, the dwarf, asks the demon king Bali for three of his little dwarf steps so he can have some space to do his ritual on. And the demon king Bali, god of the cosmos, agrees contemptuously. Yes, little dwarf, you can have your 3 steps. And then, of course, the dwarf Vishnu grows to his true cosmic proportions, and with 1 step encompasses all of the material plane, with the 2nd step all of the spiritual dimension, and with the 3rd step he boots Bali the demon king into the outer darkness. So he's conquered the whole triple world there, the entire cosmos, all of heaven and all of earth. In a very similar way, you could argue to Bridget spreading her cloak on the ground and getting the space for her church. Indian cosmology is a lot more eye-poppingly psychedelic, isn't it? The Celtic folklore that's come down to us of a similar Indo-European origin, you could argue, is a lot more muted. Maybe that's the influence of Christianity. So lots of miraculous things there in the Christian hagiography of the Saint Bridget, which may have very, very ancient origins. Another one just off the top of my head, Saint Bridget has 2 kind of magical or miraculous cattle that produce a lot of milk. This is straight up Bronze Age. Whenever you have stuff like this, it's right back to our Indo-European ancestors who came to Northern Europe millennia ago with their sort of herding lifestyles. You could draw comparisons with lots of Celtic mythology, like various fairy women, various ladies of various lakes that emerge from the water with lots of magical livestock until they're offended and go back beneath the water with all this magical livestock. These are remnants of Bronze Age myth in later Celtic folklore. I've put a link to the Lady of the Lake here. I've told it on this channel. So lots of earlier elements buried in the story of Saint Bridget, connecting to the earlier goddess Brigid. It's worth also mentioning Gerald of Wales. He was writing in the early medieval era, talking about Saint Bridget and her fire, her perpetual fire that was tended by 19 nuns, and it was kindled by Bridget herself in the 6th century, who was the 20th nun, and that fire has been burning ever since, so for several hundred years by the time Gerald was writing, and only women were allowed to tend it, and there was a circular hedge, probably of hawthorn, and no men were allowed to enter under curse of death. So That, it has been speculated, may have been a remnant of an earlier cult associated with the goddess Bridget, perhaps connected with the sacred fires of Imbolc or Imbola. It's worth mentioning as well, though, as I've already said, that some of the associations of the goddess Bridget in contemporary pagan may have come later, like this association with fire, which we don't actually find with the original goddess Bridget. But it kind of makes sense. It does kind of make sense with the associations with Imbola, and the associations with the coming of spring. Bridget is normally associated with virginity, like the Roman goddess Vesta, for example, and her Vestal virgins and her hearth, her enduring flame. So you could find some kind of links there if you wanted to. Seeing as I've mentioned the Roman goddess Vesta, other people in the 19th century have associated Bridget with the goddess Hera, the Queen of Heaven. It might be worth saying that the Romans themselves may have equated Brigantia, the possible Romano-British correlate of Bridget, with Minerva, so Athena, so goddess of wisdom, good, and war. So maybe there was more of a warlike aspect to Bridget, which was evidenced earlier, but isn't really bigged up that much by contemporary pagans, which is interesting. It's interesting that the goddess Sulis, goddess of the hot springs of Bath near here, is also associated with Minerva. So maybe goddesses of hot springs and fire have that slightly warlike quality and may have had that originally, which is lost in the kind of neo or contemporary pagan version of Bridget, which is normally more sort of sweetness and light and flowers and kisses. So just something to think about there. So the goddess Bridget, the goddess Bridget. I've already briefly said that this might be the same as the goddess Brigantia, worshipped by the Brigantes tribe in Britain. Again, the Romans associated this goddess with more warlike qualities. If their association with Minerva is accurate, you've got to be. Sometimes take the Romans with a pinch of salt with their associations with their own pantheon. But in the original material, from the Irish source material, it seems that the goddess Brìde or Brìde or Brigid was associated with the springtime, just like Saint Bridget. This would make sense because of her association with Imbola, the pre-Christian feast day, just as much as the Christian Saint's Day of Imbola on the 1st of February is associated with Saint Bridget. So that really is a piece of religious syncretism there, probably to make the Irish pagan tribes easier to convert. We'll take your goddess, make her into a saint, kind of share their qualities, plonk the saint on your pagan feast day, and we'll just kind of brush the pagan stuff under the carpet. But the Irish do this differently, and Scottish, because of the wonderful later folklore that syncretizes it. The Irish goddess Bridget was one of the Tuatha De Danann. I can really recommend this book, by the way, Islands Immortals, if you want to know more about the Irish gods in the original Irish context. So one of the Tuatha De Danann, the daughter of the Dagda. You probably know the Dagda. He's one of the more recognizable of the Irish pantheon. Big, jolly, slightly overweight chap, has a big cauldron that never empties, has a big club that kills people with one end and resurrects them from the other. He's a fertility god. He's got a big penis that carves the landscape of Britain and Ireland. He's the many-skilled god, the god of poets and sort of inspiration. You can see how these qualities have been passed on to Bridget, can't you? So Bridget, in the original material, was beloved of poets, both in the pre-Christian and early Christian eras. So she is the goddess of poets and poetry. She comes in a triple aspect, does Bridget, which is really interesting because it kind of relates to later folk ideas of the triple-fold division of the sacred feminine, virgin, mother, crone, which is a contemporary and an ancient idea. In her original Irish context, though, she's not a triple goddess. She might be, but isn't explicitly mentioned as a virgin mother crone triptych. Her triple aspect is actually healer, smith, and poet. which are kind of related things. You know, she wroughts medicine, metal, and words. She's mentioned in the mythological cycle in the second battle of Moytora. I've done a version of an element of this story on this channel, so I'll put a link to it. But it's basically where Lu of the Long Arm overcomes Balor, the demon king Balor, the Cyclops with a laser beam from his eye. It's during a time when the Tuatha, the gods, the children of the goddess Danu, if you like, have been subjugated by Bress, who is half Fomorian, half demon or titan, half Tuatha, half god, and he's subjugated all the gods. The Dagda has to do grounds maintenance and build ramparts, and Bress is married to the Dagda's daughter, married to Bridget. They have a son together whose name means Rowan, so a possible connection of Bridget to the rowan tree there. When her son dies, she is the first one to mourn him and kind of invents keening or mourning. She has various other associations which aren't really picked up on by modern pagans, such as she invents whistling in the night as a form of communication and various other things. But her role in Irish mythology doesn't really resemble her later role that much. It's also worth mentioning in later folklore, Bridget is less associated with the rowan, much more with the birch tree, which makes total sense symbolically speaking. You know, beginnings, new beginnings. Birch tree as the mother, new mother. Birch tree associated with this time of year, with Imbolc. Birch tree associated with cradles and birth giving. In that story I just said, see how many elements seem to resonate with earlier Celtic paganism as well, such as the stoup of wine and the food replenishing miraculously, just like the cauldron of the Dagda, who Bridget is literally associated with. So similar theme going on there. I've already mentioned the cloak, wrapping the cloak around the child. She also produces, Bridget in the story, I forgot to mention this bit, but produces water from the well of eternal youth on Iona to baptize the head of baby Jesus. So all these elements of Celtic spirituality feeding into the later legends of the Saint Bridget. I do need to restate the point though, as much as Bridget is clearly a pagan goddess that has segued neatly into later Christian hagiography and folklore in the legends of the saints, just clearly segued right in there. It's also worth noting that the connection between Saint Bridget and the original pagan goddess Bridget has been, people have made much more of that in the 19th and 20th centuries as part of the Celtic revival, as part of the revival of contemporary paganism, and also, of course, as part of feminism, because she's a strong female figure. Bridget, or Brìde, or as I perhaps should say, Bride, also features in 19th century folklore from Scotland involving the Cailleach and the coming of spring. This in some ways is a recent piece of folklore, but based on a much more ancient, primordial mythic motif of the dying and resurrecting God, which you could say Christianity itself is kind of mapped onto, or the bride of spring taken into the underworld by some kind of personification of winter, in this case the Cailleach, before the sort of a sun deity comes along and they're wedded to the land and give birth to summer and the harvest. This ancient motif of the solar cycle and the agrarian cycle that is based on it, with its various personifications and deities that are springing forth from that. That has been going on for a very long time in mythology. Think sort of Demeter and Hades and what have you, Osiris and all them. But also in recent folklore as well, it is echoed, such as the story of Angus, the Cailleach and the Bride, which I'll put a link to here because I told it a few Imbolcs ago. So check out that story if you want to hear more recent folklore involving the goddess Bridget.